All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be utilizing React with JavaScript to try to get some responsive web design implemented into our website. We're going to be going over how to utilize all of these different CSS layouts. Today, we're going to just concentrate and actually just using CSS for pretty much the entire all of our designs. We're going to go into media tags, how those work, and we're going to go into different units of measurement to be able to implement them so that when our screen gets smaller, so does the content inside of our screen, making it adaptive for mobile devices as well as desktops. And then tomorrow, we're going to take today's lecture and evolve it into utilizing different styling libraries, such as Bootstrap and Tailwind CSS, which are just really popular libraries that everybody utilizes nowadays. All right. With that said, let me do a quick project overview. This is a React project. I have already ran npm install. You can know that I've ran npm install because I have node modules and I also have package-lock.json. I don't have any extra dependencies other than the regular Vite build that comes with this. You can see that app.js has been emptied out, so there's nothing inside of app.js. App.css is completely empty, and so is index.css. Very well. Now, before we dive into the lecture, does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be covering today? Right. Since there are no questions, let's go ahead and dive straight in. So the first thing we're going to be talking about today is the different types of display. There is display block, display inline, and then there's display inline block. And that's before we get into the whole flexbox thing. So let's start taking a look at these examples. And you're going to notice that today's code, a lot of it is going to be strictly from the curriculum. Dot box times okay, let's do 10. Nice. All right, so there's all of our divisions. We have one parent division that is holding everything. We're going to give this division an ID of boxes. Then we have all of our subdivisions, which is just a independent box, all with a class name of box. All right. Now let's take a look at what our boxes are going to actually look like inside of app.css. We're going to add this styling class here, where we're going to create a box. We're going to give it a simple height of 10 pixels. We will also give it a simple width of, and I said 10, but I meant to do 100 pixels. There you go. And then we're going to go into adding some padding here. Let's go ahead that we have some padding of 2 pixels, a margin of 10 pixels, finally a border of 2 pixels solid. Let's do the classic black there so we can actually see it. And then we'll mess around with display here shortly. All right. So the first display that we are seeing here, we can see that the parent division of app.css doesn't have any sort of CSS applied to it, right? The parent division here with the ID of boxes doesn't have any CSS being applied to it. And if we take a look at the console, we can see what their default values are coming in. If we go into elements, take a look at the body, open up the root directory, now take a look at boxes. Well, inside of boxes, if we open this up, we can see that there's a tab named styles. And in styles, it tells me, hey, this is a display block. What does that mean? That means that the division of boxes automatically takes up the entire screen or the entire width of the screen from left to right. And then it assumes the height of as much content that is inside of it. Right, so there's nothing blocking how how tall or ID of box this is, or this container is. Right, if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we can see that we still have that container there. And a box has the computed styles of CSS that we added into it. Great. Well, now let's take a look at the different display attributes that we have and how they're going to affect this box here. All right, so we've already seen block. We know that block is the default. If we go into one of these boxes, oh, there you go. So there's the box. We gave the division a default width, and that's the reason why it's not stretching all the way to the right-hand corner when you hover over it. But you'll also notice that the remaining of the content, instead of piling up on the right-hand side of it, is automatically dropping to the bottom. So even though we gave it a default width, it's still in display block, meaning that nothing else can go on this row right up above. Where's this zoom annotation tool? There you go. So this whole row is being occupied by this one division and nothing else is being added. Oh, how do I delete it now? Oh no. All right. Well, now let's see what happens when we add a display function. So I'm going to add a display, and the next display that I want to see is inline. Whoa, well, that looks completely different than what it did before, right? Here you are. I added the inline functionality, and now let's take a look at boxes. So my container is still occupying the entire width from left to right, but notice how the boxes are now leaking out of the container, right? And if I take a look at box, and we open this up to look at the computed styles, you could see that because I added this inline here, height and width are no longer being applied, right? Or they're not being considered by the CSS. So what's happening? Well, essentially, when I add this inline portion, what it does is, hey, I'm going to adopt the height and the height of my parent. So in this case, our division does not have a height, so it defaults to the smallest height possible. And then afterwards, I am going to try to have a relative width where all of the content will still fit inside of this one line. All right, so that's the reason why it's disregarding the height and width, because it's trying to adapt to the parent. All right, so let's change it back. Let's go back to our block, which is our default. That turns it back. And then we have inline, where it adopts to the parent and gets rid of our height and width. Well, someone noticed the issue here and then said, well, there's got to be a happy medium somewhere. And that happy medium is inline block. All right, so you can see how inline block becomes reactive. It still analyzes the height and width of each individual division or each individual box. And as I close my screen, the parent division gets thinner. And because the parent division is getting thinner, once it can't fit a box, it drops it down into the next column, increasing the height of the parent division automatically and causing a responsive design. All right, so there's 3 different types of display so far. Does anyone have any questions over those displays? All right, I don't see anything in Yankee questions. Give it a couple more seconds just in case something populates. Okay, so let's take a look a little bit at box sizing and how this is working. All right, so for example, right now we have 10 boxes. If I were to go to and number them, let's do that. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. There you go. All right, we know that we have all 10 boxes here. Well, if I were to make this exactly, and you can see the number of pixels here in the upper right-hand corner. If I were to try to make this 1000 pixels, almost there. There it is, 1000 pixels. So there we have our screen width of 1000 pixels, right? And I come up to boxes. Boxes is 984, so that's a problem. What's going on here? Let me make sure. Oh, it's my body. Let me get rid of that margin there. ID of root 1000, ID of boxes. Okay, great. So there we have our boxes, and we can see that the container that's holding all the boxes has a width of 1000 pixels and a height of 254 pixels. But now I have a question for everyone. If that is the case, currently the width of my boxes is 100 pixels. So why is it that my boxes aren't just all fitting from left to right inside of one independent row?
It's because you added margin to your boxes. You have 10 pixels of margin for every box. So there's actually 20 pixels in between every box.
Oh, all right, let's take a look there. So there's my extra 10 pixels. There's another 10 pixels. So now I have 20 pixels here. I have 20 pixels there, and so on. All right, so let's try to fix that. Let's get rid of the margin. See what it does. Okay, well, I still don't fit all 10 of these elements. What else could be causing that?
Your border.
All right, so currently my border is at 2 pixels. So I'm just going to decrease my width here to 96 because I have 2 pixels on the left and I have 2 pixels on the right. Okay, I just decreased it to 96. Let's also fix that there. All right, that's still not fitting all of them. What else could be happening?
Padding. Everybody, maybe.
All right, let's take a look. So here's my box itself. And if we take a look at the box, the dimensions of the box comes out to 103.2. So there's definitely something going on that is increasing the content of my box, right? At this point, I expected it to be 100. So let's go ahead and turn this padding into 0. And now when we turn the padding into 0, we can see that it's able to fit all 10 of my boxes. It seems like that it's a little off. They're at 99.2 rather than a solid 100. But we can see how those dimensions can be applicable, and it's important to pay attention to them, right? So that kind of goes back into our box model. We could have utilized this box model to see the padding, the border, the margin, the borders and how they work. For example, the border that I have here on my CSS is 2, and you can see that we have a 1.6, which is what's actually being interpreted by the browser. Right. All right. Awesome. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is going to be our positions. So here we have a container, and let me actually bring back this margin here of 10 pixels just so that we could see some spaces there. And let's go into, I really don't like how this named is boxes. I'm going to change it to container. So now we have our container with a bunch of boxes inside of it. Let's access this set container. And I want to talk about positioning here. And we'll just call box 5 and give it ID of the box. All right, so there's container, and we have, oh, the box. And this box, we're just going to give it a background color of yellow, just so that we know where it's at. So there's our background color of yellow. And now we have a container. Now, for this container, what we can do is we can change its position styles. And there's a couple of different positions. There is position static, there's position relative, and position fixed. All right. So let's talk about that. First, here we have our box. And if we were to change the box to position relative, you'll see that nothing really changes as of now, right? It's relative to its current location. But now if I give it a top of, I don't know, 25 pixels, you'll see that it moves down. Well, relative from its current location, I want it to move down 25 pixels. So I want there to be 25 pixels on top of said box, right? And if I were to add left 50 pixels, it's going to move to the right by 50 pixels. All right, so that's how we could do something like position relative to change the position of our box. All right. Now there's also position fixed. Oh, let's hear one.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure the top and left, that's not the same as like margin top and left, right? That's only, those are only really used with position relative right now.
Correct. These is just referencing to the position itself. And it's not adding a margin. It's simply just saying, hey, from where this is supposed to be rendered, I want to go down 25 pixels and right 50 pixels. All right. Now let's change this position attribute to fixed and see what it does. Well, position fixed, notice how the inline block now doesn't account for that fifth element, right? It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, skips it, goes right into 6, but keeps everything else in the display. So position fix takes this box out of the consideration of the parent division styling, and it says, hey, from, if we take a look, position fixed will actually render it right where it's supposed to be located, right? We don't see 6 because 6 is actually behind this number 5. But when I say top 25 pixels, it moves down from the parent 25 pixels. But now look at right. If I say, oh, excuse me, left. Right? If I say left 50 pixels, it goes 50 pixels from the left-hand side of the parent. In this case, the parent is the container. So it's saying, hey, the parent container, I want you to move right 50 pixels from the left edge of the parent container. So that's position fixed. Position relative is from where this element is supposed to be rendered, and it still keeps the element into the consideration of the parent styling. If we go back and we change it to relative, we can see that the number 6 shifts over, right? And it leaves the space that was supposed to be left for 5. So it's still being considered. But if I change it back to position fixed, it no longer considers the position for the element of 5. It just goes straight into 6, and it renders 5 as an independent child. All right. Does anyone have any questions between the differences of fixed and relative? Let's hear it, James.
Is there a specific reason why box 5
appears in front of everything else as opposed to behind, or like if it, I could also see it like overlapping in like really weird ways. Is there a reason why it's on top?
Yeah, it's a great question. So once you mess around with the positions and try to render it, it's always going to place that element that is not following the position relative to the container on top of everything else. It's going to increase, it's called a Z index. It's going to increase the Z index so that it's always on top. And we'll be talking about Z index later on in this lecture. So we could always manipulate this to change it, but know that once you add the position attribute, it's going to place it on top of the other children. Does that answer your question, James?
Yes, it does. Is the index a React thing, or is that also in normal CSS?
It's a CSS thing.
Okay.
Awesome. Owen?
With box number 5 being fixed, say you had like 100 boxes to where you'd have to scroll down, box number 5 would always appear on the screen, correct? Or would it always be on the top of the page?
Not sure. Let's try it out. Let's say if class of box times 40 half 10. So let's just do 90. All right, so now as I scroll down, we can see that it does stick there. All right, so we have it in position fixed, and in relation to what the user is seeing, this stays the entire time as I'm scrolling down.
Thank you.
That's a weird thing that's going on here. I'm not sure why there's a gap right here. But we can see all of our divisions and classes showing up. Awesome. All right, so now we've taken a look at our positions. And let me actually get rid of all these boxes that I've created now. All right. Awesome, I didn't break anything. Good. So then we have all our divisions. We've gone over the different types of positions. Let's see what's going to be our next topic. All right, so now we have our position absolute. And we are going to demonstrate this portion utilizing 3 separate divisions. Let me go ahead and comment out our boxes just so that this code stays here. I wouldn't want it to get lost out of demos and notes. And let's bring down a division that is going to have the class name of outer, with a division that will have the class name of middle, with a division that will have the class name of inner. All right, so there's our 3 divs all being applied. You can see we have outer, middle, and inner being displayed here. Now let's go into app CSS and add a little bit of CSS styling so that we could see how this is going to look like. So first we're going to have outer. Outer is going to have a height of 400 pixels, a width of 400 pixels. It is also going to have a background color of gray. Oh, excuse me, this should be black. And it is going to have a position relative. All right, next we're going to go into middle. Now middle is going to have a height of 300 pixels. Going to have a width of 300 pixels. And it's going to have a background color here of green. All right, so there we can see it. And then finally we can go into inner. Inner has a height of 50 pixels, a width of 50 pixels. And it also has a background color of red. So up to this point, we can see all three of our squares showing up. We have a small reactor here. Let's take a look at what this is. Oh, that's not an actual real error. All right. So there we have our three boxes. We have our outer, which is this black box here. We have green, which is our middle. And then we have red, which is showing us that tiny red box on the upper left-hand corner. Now notice that the position here for this red box currently doesn't exist, right? We haven't added a position attribute. The only position attribute that we have is this position relative. Now, let's start talking about what position absolute will do. So we come down to inner and we change this to position absolute. And from position absolute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, I want right to be 5 pixels. And I want bottom to be 10 pixels. Well, notice how that it's moving the red square, not in relation to its parent division, but in relation to the division that has a position relative. So whenever you utilize position absolute will always look for a parental division that holds position relative. And that's what it's going to relate these following measurements to. So it's saying, hey, I want to be 5 pixels to the right of outer, and I want to be 10 pixels from the bottom of outer. And that's how we get our box showing up on that lower right-hand corner. If we wanted it to change and we wanted to see this division showing up here on the lower left-hand square, well, we would just have to change our position relative to middle. And now, when we utilize position absolute, inner is looking for a position relative. It finds it inside of the middle division, and it says, hey, I want to be 5 pixels from the right. Oh, I pointed that to the wrong attribute of the width, and I want to be 10 pixels from the bottom of the height. And that's how we get our red square showing up on that lower right-hand corner. All right, so whenever we utilize position absolute, it is looking for position relative in one of its parent divisions, or the nearest parent division. If both of these have position relative, notice that nothing changed, and that's because it's looking for the first parent division that has the position relative attribute. Middle is the first parent division that has that attribute, so that's where our position absolute will be indicating all of its styling for. All right, I saw a couple of hands go up and then go back down. Go ahead, Tristan.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question, but then you answered it in between. But then I have another one. If you have, let's say, 2 of them that have position relative, how would you make it to where the one that has position absolute, you want it to go to a specific parent that has relative in it? Or would you just not have it in another class there?
I think that's more of where it falls, right? So here in abstract, so right now we have 2 divisions that have position relative, right? We have outer and we have middle. Both of them have position relative. If you wanted to, if the scenario arises where you needed position relative in both of these scenarios, right, in both of these divisions, but you wanted inner's position absolute to look at outer, well, then you just have to move where inner exists, right? So if you move inner outside of that division, then it's going to take a look at outer. It's just looking
Okay.
at the division.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. Jacob?
Is that just like following the principle of like cascading? Because like it goes down like the form or whatever and checks to see like what was the last one that had relative? Is that like the concept that's kind of being applied here?
Kind of. I could see what you're referencing to. But I think the easiest way to remember it is just it's going to look for the first parent that has position relative.
Okay. Thank
But
you.
yeah. Okay, awesome. Any other questions?
Yeah, just for clarity. So the keyword position doesn't matter where it is within middle or outer. It's just a direct parent.
Could you say that again, Juan?
The keyword position within middle and outer, that order doesn't matter. What matters is that inner has absolute and its direct parent is middle.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both, right? Because we do definitely want to pay attention to which one of these has position relative. For example, middle, if we remove position relative from it, you'll see that inner applies its styling to outer. So I think that the position relative keyword or this combination of styling is very important because that's what position absolute is looking for. So position absolute looks to its parent division, in this case being middle, and says, hey, where's position relative? All right, you don't have position relative. I'm going to move up a level. And then it moves up a level into outer. And then it asks the same question, where's position relative? In this case, position relative is right here. So then it grabs these right and bottom indexes and applies them to the height and width.
Alrighty, thank you.
Of course. James?
Could you apply position relative to like the whole body? Since that's the next parent, does it have to be like a div where position relative is applied?
You can apply it to the entire body. Yes. All right. Okay. Awesome. Now, the next thing that we're going to be covering is going to actually be z-index. Z-index is a tricky one. So we might have to save it, but let's give it a stab. And if we could get it, then fantastic. All right, so let's try. Oh, that's my annotation tool. Let me get rid of this. Let's bring in z-index here. Say z-index is 10. And then I want z-index to be 5. And then finally, I am going to remove these and say z-index is 1. And that is not working the way I was hoping it was going to work. All right, we're gonna have to come back to z-index just so I could take some time to refresh myself on it, and then we could do an example. So instead, the next thing that we're gonna be looking at is going to be floats. So let me go ahead and comment out all of these inner outer boxes here. Let me go to app.jsx, comment this out. And let's start talking about floats. So I have a division. This division is going to be an image. We're just going to give it a class here. It's a class name, and we're just going to call this float me right. And then we're also going to do an image there. So it has two classes. It has float me right and an image. Now we're going to have a text block here. And this text block is just going to have a ridiculous amount of lorem ipsum inside of it. All right, so there's our lorem ipsum. Here's our division of an image. Let's make that image. What did I miss here? Oh, there you go. All right, let's create this image here. It probably would have been easier if I grabbed an actual image. Let's just do that. Let's just do Poke API. Let's bring in our good old Ditto here. Take a look at sprites. Where's my, there you are. And let's grab this front default attribute here. All right, so let's just do. That didn't work. All right, so now we have our image, it has Ditto, and we have all of our text. Well, now we're gonna go ahead and add some CSS here so that we can move Ditto to either sides of this paragraph. Let's take a look at what our CSS is going to look like. So we have our an image here, which we know it's a class. This class is going to have a height of 50 pixels, and it is going to have a width of 50 pixels. We're just gonna add a background color as well so that we can see it. Let's just do this red here. All right, so there's our image. And then we have our text block, which we didn't add into our division, but we will add it here shortly. And this will have a font size of 24 pixels. All right, let's go into app.jsx. And let's give this a class of text block. All right, so there's all of our text. We have our entire text block. The font size is 24 pixels that just has lorem ipsum inside of it. We have our image there in the upper right-hand side. Great. Well, now how do we actually make this float, right? When we go read some newspaper articles or something like that, we usually have images maybe on the left-hand side, maybe in between in the bottom or the right. Well, let's see what happens. Let's see how we can implement that information or that display. What I'm going to do is I'm going to access the class of float me right. And for this class, I'm just going to simply add the attribute of float. And we can see float left there. We can see it being added. Let's increase the height and width, maybe. All right, so we increase the height and width. We can see how it floated it left, right? It has exactly 500 pixels, and then the text starts. And it even does this really nice indentation here at the bottom saying, hey, well, this line still gets cut off, but right after this line here of tempore mortem, we're no longer affected by the picture because that's the very bottom. So instead of keeping everything only to the right-hand side and cutting it, on the next line, it actually goes all the way to the start of the screen. And to make things even better, this is actually very responsive. If I start squeezing my screen size, you can see that more of the lorem ipsum falls to the bottom. And if I start opening up my screen, you can see more of the lorem ipsum falls to the right-hand side. 500 pixels might have been a little too ambitious. Let's go ahead and change that to 250. That's probably better. There you go. All right, so that's floating it to the left. Let's see what happens if we float it to the right. Well, it does the same exact effect, just on the right-hand side. Let's see if there's any other attributes for float. Well, we have inline left, we have none. Let's do inline start. Okay, so inline start is another way to do left. And then we have inline end. Which is just another way of doing right. Now, if I had this in some sort of display column where things were being from top to bottom, if I do inline start, that would be placing the float on the top. And inline end would be placing the float on the bottom. All right. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding float? Let's hear it, Jacob.
Yeah, can you go back to app.jsx real quick?
Sure.
So, oh yeah, so your class names, like I was wondering about that. So like if it has like a space between it and those quotation marks, like you can reference each of those, like you reference float me right separately from an image in CSS, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay,
So
yeah, I didn't know you could do that. That's
yeah,
something new. Okay. And also as far as the responsiveness of is that built into CSS or is that like a React thing that's doing that? Because I was just wondering, like, if this wasn't like a JSX file that the CSS could like say it was just like a JS file, would it do the same thing, or is that something that you need like a React feature for? Does that make sense?
it does. Yes. This is all just plain CSS. So all of this
Okay.
activeness that we're doing could apply to a regular HTML page.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?
Yeah, what is there any other use cases where you'd want to use float or display float where like instead of text it would be, is there any other common use cases where you'd like have an image and then something wrapping around it, or vice versa, like having something that just wraps around some certain object?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's say something like a drop-down menu, or it's kind of hard to think of an example off the top of my head, but something that I could think about is, oh, that is my annotation tool. Let me get rid of that. Something I could think about, let's say I click on Ditto, right? Or I have multiple images of Pokemon. And when I click on one of these Pokemon, what I wanted to do is I wanted to open up some sort of menu of information showing me more details about this Pokemon. Well, I need to find a way to do something with the remainder of those images, right? So you could utilize float so that those images of the other Pokemon will just push to the left-hand side, wrap around it, versus utilizing inline, because when you utilize inline, it may not wrap the way you want it to, or it may not respect the dimensions of that drop-down menu, since it's something new that's being created. So float might be the best option as far as making sure that everything else falls to the bottom. Does that answer your question, Owen? Okay, I saw the yep. Fantastic. All right. So let's start taking a look at what other things we can apply in this example. All right. We can add attributes such as clear into the text block. And let's see what that does. So if I go into the text block and I say, hey, I want you to clear right. We'll take a look at that, right? So right is now clear. Well, let's check what happens if we do clear left. If we do clear left, all of the text gets squeezed into the left-hand side of the image. So let's bring this back to right. Okay, so now it's on the right-hand side. All of the text is squeezed to the left-hand side of the image. If we switch this to left, well, we have to be floating on the left-hand side, right? Which should push the text to the right, but we're saying, hey, we don't want you to push to the right at all of this image. We want you to stay clear to the left. So because I move my image to the left-hand side, the text can't go in the right, so it just falls into the bottom. All right, move this back to the right-hand side. All right, my image is on the right. I'm telling, hey, I want you to squeeze all of the text to the left, stay clear to the left. So all the text falls on the left-hand side. and vice versa, right? I could change these back and forth, say, hey, I want you to go right. Again, we're telling it to go to the right of the image. Can't do that because the image is being floated, right? But as soon as I change the image being floated to the left, well, now it's able to squeeze the text on the right-hand side of said image. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding clear? Okay, clear seems to be pretty self-explanatory, so let's go ahead and move into our next portion here. I'm gonna comment out this code. I'm also gonna comment our paragraph and image tags here. And we're gonna go back to our boxes example.
Sorry, Francisco, real quick, it just came to mind. That clear attribute, it doesn't just work on text, right? That can work on anything, so it can work on other division tags and images and stuff.
That's correct. These attributes can apply to
Okay.
multiple tags. All right. Okay, so let's bring back our boxes here. And where are my boxes? Here you are. Let me take off this fixed here. All right, so I'm taking off the fix. We have it all in inline block, or we have, yes, we do have it all in inline block. And currently, when there is an overflow, you can see it being wrapped around. Well, that's because the container doesn't have some sort of limitation, right? So let's add this limitation. Let's say, hey, I want the container to have a height of, let's say, 125 pixels. And I also want this container to have a width of 1000 pixels. All right, so let's take a look at our elements here and see what we're working with. So here's container, and you can see that container has that set height. But outside of container, we have boxes 9 and 10. They're falling outside of the container, right? And just to visualize it, let's go ahead and do a border. Let's do red, dashed, and let's do 1 pixel. All right, so there's our border there. We can see it red and dashed. Maybe instead of 1 pixel, we do something like 5. There you go. So we can see how it's falling out. And if I stretch out the division, it's still falling out because it's outside, right? So before, we were utilizing the entire width from left to right of my screen, but now I have a set width of 1000. Wow, it's a lot harder to write with the mouse than I thought. So this boxes 9 and 10 never fit inside of our parent division. Okay, well, that's fine, but maybe there's something that we want to do as far as boxes 9 and 10, right? I don't necessarily want them to fall out of my division here, or I don't want them to branch outside of this division, especially if this division is something that's nicely styled and I have other components down below, then I'm dealing with all this overlapping and things just merging together. Doesn't look good. All right. So how do we fix that? Well, inside of the container, we need to find a way to deal with overflow. So I can do something like overflow hidden. And now you can see that boxes 9 and 10 go away. They are no longer there. I can't see them because I'm just simply hiding them. All right, my entire 1000 is there. The boxes still exist. You could still access them through HTML components, right? They're showing up in box 9 and 10. So they're still divisions. And they're still present inside of my HTML page. They're just hidden. They're not visible to the user, and it doesn't affect the rest of my CSS. Now, another way to do this is adding overflow and saying, hey, I want to scroll to my overflow. Well, now check it out. Now we have these bars here, both on the lower corner and on the upper corner, where a scroll bar would be represented. And what I can do is I can now have the user scroll down within the same division and find their overflowed components. Right, and you could clean it up a little bit. Maybe I don't want both the X and Y, so maybe I could do scroll Y, I believe it's what it's called. Oh, there you go. Overflow dash Y. There you go. And now you only have the bar on the right-hand side being able to scroll up and down. And that is how you handle overflowing components inside of some menu. Right? And I'm sure everyone can think of a couple of examples, specifically Netflix, right? In Netflix, there is one division that is holding all of those different movie icons, almost like this red division that we have here. And essentially what happens is it renders everything that comes back from the API call. You log into Netflix, you click on your profile, a request gets sent to a server saying, hey, I want the films that this person may be interested in. Their AI does the thing where it analyzes your personality and comes back with a bunch of results of what kind of films you may be interested in. It returns that inside of an API response, goes back to the React that's being rendered on your machine, and then finally React shows a division with boxes of each one of those films. And when those films start overflowing to the left or right hand side, well, now you have the ability to either click on a button here that will essentially scroll, because they're still scrolling. It's just jumping the image to the next set of films, whether it's 10 or 15 films, and showing them over and over again so that you could choose the movie that you would like to watch. All right, so there's a practical application of this being implemented. All right, does anyone have any questions over how to handle overflowed components? Let's hear it, James.
Is there a reason why box 9 and 10 are overflowing below as opposed to just continuing to the right of box 8?
Yes. So the reason behind that is because I still have an annotation tool, is because we have inline block being implemented. When you utilize inline block, it's not just going from left to right. It is going, I'm going to try to squeeze as many elements as I can from left to right. But once I can't squeeze any more elements, instead of squeezing into the right-hand side, I'm going to drop them to the next row and then start again from left to right. Does that answer your question, James?
Yes, and that box, so the inline block applies to the parent div in this case, as opposed to before was applying to like the full width of the page.
Got it. So the inline block is for each individual box. So instead of occupying the entire space to the right-hand side, the box is saying, hey, I want you to still allow other elements to flow to the right-hand side of me. The division, or the parent, which is the container, has a max width of 1000. So once it's no longer able to allow any more of these boxes to fall to the right-hand side, it just says, all right, well, I can't fit anymore, so I want you to start down here. And that's how we get box 9 and box 10.
Okay, cool. If you wanted to hypothetically like have, like you were saying in the Netflix example, if you wanted to scroll instead of down to see box 9 and 10, you would scroll to the right to see box 9 and 10. How would you like overflow X scroll? Would that
Yes.
alone fix it, or?
So overflow X will allow us to scroll to the left and right-hand side. But what will fix it is we're going to be looking to display flex during the second portion of the lecture, and that's what will give us that layout. Awesome. Juan?
Well, thank you.
Of course.
Sorry, I was writing it down. You actually just answered my question.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. All right. If there are no other questions, the next thing that we're going to go over is going to be some of our pseudo and dynamic things that we can do, like actions. Right. So let's go into our box here. We have the box already planned out. So let's just add some pseudo into the box. Let's say, hey, I want the box, and I can add an action to it. And I can say, hey, I want the box something like hover. To have a background color red. All right, so here's the box. Currently it falls where it's supposed to be. And now I added an action attribute. Well, now you'll see that before we've done this utilizing JavaScript, where when you hover on top of something, it changes color. Well, now CSS is doing it for us, right? We could change this information. I can also have it do other things inside of that hover. Maybe I want to change its height. Or I can say, hey, I want its height to be, I don't know what it was before. I think it was 100. So let's say 125 pixels. And I want its width to be 125 pixels. So then this way, when I hover over it, it gets a little bit bigger than the other app boxes that you can see there. So that's one of the dynamic things. We could apply that to anchor tags as well. Let's take a look at an anchor tag here really quick. Let's do an anchor tag with href of https://amazon.com. And let's do Amazon. All right, so there's our link up there. And now let's talk a little bit about what we can do to that tag, right? So here's our anchor tag. And let's say that I want the link to be of color, and let's do green. All right, so there it is. Where did my anchor tag go? Oh,
It's gone.
okay. That was really weird. All right, well, there you go. It doesn't seem like that actually changed much into it. I'm sure if we zoom in, maybe we could see a difference. No, we can't. Interesting. Huh. Let me go ahead and move into a different example. I wonder why that one's not working. Let's do visited, and let's have it change to a color. Should do red. All right, so I've already visited. Let me refresh it. Oh. Seems like it's able to analyze that I've already visited, and that turns it into red. And then we could even add an active color. Just do yellow, throw it in there. So there you can see it. When I click it, it turns yellow. I've already visited, so it's red. And then we could add a hover attribute as well if we wanted to. So let's do hover and say color, I don't know, cyan. I know. So there you go. I hover, it turns cyan. I click, oh, and it should turn yellow, but it looks like the hover is overriding it. Yeah, so the hover is overriding it and taking over when I click it. So there's a little bit of cascading here. Let me see if I can do this number. There you go. All right. So it's originally the color red because I've already visited the link. I hover over it it turns cyan. I click it, it makes it active, it turns a yellow. Just had to do a little bit of fixing of the cascading there. Right, but there's a couple of JavaScript, or there's some JavaScript functionality that you may want to write that you could accomplish with CSS as well. Now the question is, or the question that I usually get is, well, if I could do it with JavaScript and I could do it with CSS, which one of the two should I do? I think it matters on two things. One, what are you most comfortable with? Whichever one you're most comfortable with, I think that's the priority. Unless you're trying to grow and you have time to grow, then go with the one that you're most uncomfortable with so that you can actually capture that information and get better at utilizing something different. And two is how much control do you need over the dynamics, right? Or how much control do you actually desire from this reactiveness? If you need a lot of control, then do it with JavaScript. If you don't need a lot of control, do it with CSS. So those are my two little pieces of advice as to which ones you should utilize. All right. Awesome. So there we saw some dynamic behavior that you can add with some pseudocode. We saw how divisions and classes work. And I see a question. Give me a second so I could do some overview. We went over overflow. We covered clear. We have not covered z-index. We went over floats. We went over absolute positions, fixed positions, and our different types of positions. And we also covered the different types of displays. All right, at this point, does anyone have any questions over topics that were covered today? All right, let's hear from Juan.
Just to see if I understood you correctly. So if we're using it, for example, in CSS over HT or React, sorry, for functionality wise, like something like the hover effect, if I wanted to add like a actual functionality to it, then I should probably do it in React. And if not in CSS, or you're just saying generally speaking?
I think it's generally speaking, if you want to have complete control over the reaction that's happening inside of your web page and you don't want it to have some default value, because CSS is providing you some functionality, but it's all default, right? It doesn't adjust to your specific cases. So if you have something specific that you need to implement, utilize JavaScript. Awesome. Gary, I see a question on the chat. When would it matter what unit use in CSS? Pixels, VS, VH, VMin, etc. We're going to be covering that during the second portion of our lecture. It definitely does matter, especially when you're making reactive sites. You always want to have some sort of reactive unit of measurement. And I also want to add, when you're using reactive units of measurements, the most important thing is consistency. Because if you start mixing them up all together, they're not going to relate to one another properly, and you're going to get some really inappropriate behavior. So ensure that once you decide, hey, I'm going to utilizing vmin for my entire website, or I'm going to be utilizing percentages for my entire website, that's what stays, right? There could be one or two exceptions that you might want to throw in there, but consistency is key when it comes to units of measurements. Does that answer your question, Gary?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, my follow-up was gonna be because Adam had just answered. I was wondering, is there a way to add multiple measurements to just just a block of CSS and whatever device that the user's on, that's what it tailors to? Or
There is. So what you're referencing to is media queries. Well, we're gonna be covering that during the second portion of our lecture, so I don't want to open up that Pandora's box just yet. All right. Okay, great. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions. I don't see anything in Yankee questions. Let me check the Zoom chat here real quick. Okay, I don't see anything in the Zoom chat either. Let me go ahead and stop the recording. All right. So we just finished our CSS layout. The one thing that we didn't cover was our z-index. So let's go ahead and start covering z-index now. So as you can see here in app.jsx, I have a parent with position relative, and I have 3 divisions inside of it with all position absolute. And and with different sizes, just to demonstrate that we have a red box, green box, and a gray box. Now, this is position relative. All three of these divisions are position absolute, meaning that they are falling on the top left-hand corner of my division. They're just of different sizes, right? And they are all brothers of one another. They are all children of the. So with that said, how does Z index apply here? Well, you can see here that we have first, which is the color red. We have green, which is back here. Let's say we wanted to bring some of these between back and forth, right? Well, I could bring second by adding a Z index of 10 all the way to the front. And now the red box is almost invisible, right? Well, with that said, I can say, hey, I want this to go right 50. Okay, let me take off this Z index so I can see what's going on there. Oh, forgot to add my pixels. Okay, so right 50 didn't do what I was expecting. Let's do left 50. All right, so left 50 is pushing it. May have to push it a little bit more. Let's do 250. Too far. And 250 is pushing it almost to the outside. Let's bring it back to 3. Now we can see it, and let's bring back that Z index. Well, now we can see that the green color, even though it's the second, it's falling on top. That is because it has the Z index of 10. If we want to bring the gray to the top, we just simply need to add a Z index higher than the number 10. So if I turn it into 11, 11 outgrows the 10. If I turn it into 9, well, 9 is less than 10. So we can see the green box, then the gray populates, but we're not able to see the red box because currently the Z index of red by default is 1. All right, so now in order to bring the red box back up top, I need the Z index to be 11. And now we can see the red box on top of everything else, right? So 11, 10, and 9. If I bring this back down to 9, then it will fall as such. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding Z index before we move on in our lecture? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. With that said, I'm gonna actually create a component just so that I can put all of this code inside of said component and it won't be affecting us. So let me go ahead and do that here. I'm gonna go into src, make dir components, change directory into components, and then touch layout.jsx. All right, let's code layout just JSX here, and let's do const layout. And this is going to export default. Oh, hello. There you go. I would have been better off just typing it out. And now let's just grab all of the code that we have here in app.jsx. Let's bring it over to layout. Let's see, turn. All right, so all of it is saved in here. If we want to use it, we can. Let me just delete this so that these can actually get commented out here. There you go. All right, everything is now commented. It's being exported. Now inside of app.jsx, I'm going to go ahead and import it. And then I'm going to go ahead and call the layout component just so that it's there. Great. All right, so here's our layout component. It's now all completely empty because I commented out. We can go back and uncomment it. And if I uncomment it, we'll see that all of our code repopulates. So everything is there. No issues there. App.jsx is now completely clean. So we could go into the second portion of our lecture in responsive web design. All right. I'm actually going to utilize index.css to write all the CSS for responsive web design, just so that we also have separate files and it doesn't get into the way. All right. So when it comes to responsive web design, how does this work? All right. We have all these different measurements, but how is the application itself able to relate these measurements to the screen being rendered, or the screen where the application is being rendered? Right, this goes back all the way into our HTML concepts. Do we remember what tag it is that HTML utilizes to get a ratio for design between the screen and the browser?
Is it Vim?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Is it Vim?
Vim? So Vim is a form of terminal or text editor. Actually, inside of index.html, we have this meta viewport here. And this is what relates the width of the device to the initial scale of 1.0. It's what gives us our ratio, saying, hey, depending on the width of the device or the amount of the device that's available, this is how we want to utilize our content or move around our content. So let's start seeing a couple of examples of how to implement these different units of measurement, right? So starting off with good old text. How does text work? And how do we make it work properly, right? So the first thing that we're going to be covering is going to be our units of measurement. So let's talk about that. Inside of this tag here, I'm going to have a division, and I'm just going to give it the ID of measurements. And let's just simply go into our index.css here. Let me close all the other things that we have open. And let's add the measurement ID. So now in the measurement ID, I'm going to give it a border. Going to make it solid. Going to make it 5 pixels. And well, let's make it black so that it populates, right? So here it is. Looks like we named it measurements. All right, and then we get a small black line at the top of our browser showing me the different measurements. Well, let's talk about our height component here, right? So far, what we've been utilizing is something like pixels. If I make it 50 pixels, well, now I have a 50 pixel height. Regardless of how small my screen is or how big my screen is, I can make my screen really, really small. So let's say that we go into the inspector tools and we click on this handy dandy screen selector here. And it drops down different dimensions. You could choose maybe an iPhone that you're trying to design for. What I typically do is I choose the smallest screen possible that they have, which I believe in this case, iPad mini, nope, that's way too big. It might be the iPhone. Yeah, in this case, it's the iPhone SE, right? So we can see that the height is still 50 pixels, no matter what. Well, let's start experimenting with this. What happens if we turn this to 50%? What does our height look like then? Or our height still stays stuck to the top. I wonder why that is. Well, if we take a look at our console here, I go inside of my body tag. Notice that my body only has a height of 10 pixels. Right? If I come over to the body only has a height of 10 pixels. If I go over to the division of root, the division of root also only has a height of 10 pixels. So when I go into my division of measurements and I tell it, hey, I want you to have a height of 100%, well, body and division don't really have a height. They only have those 10 pixels because my border is 5 pixels on the bottom and 5 pixels on top. So when I'm trying to utilize percentage, I am saying, hey, I want you to be 50% of the parent division. Well, 50% of 0 is still 0, and 50% of 0 is also 0. So it's just saying, okay, well, then you don't want me to have a height at all. All right. So let's try to experiment with this unit of measurement here. There is something called view height, meaning, hey, take the entire height, and I want you to assume 50% of it. So now if we come down, here's our block, and maybe we want to add a background color here, or you know what, we'll just turn it dashed. All right, so there it is, it's dashed, and you can see that 50% or half of the view height is being occupied by this division. All right. Okay, awesome. So if there is something like view height, there must be something like view width. Well, view width, it takes the width of the element, divides it, and it sets half of it as the height. Let me draw that out, right? So it takes the width of the screen, cuts it in half, and says, oh, this is what our height is going to be. So it flips it and places it here as our height. All right, so that's what utilizing 50 VW does. Now you may think to yourself, oh, okay, well then in that case, whenever I utilize something like a width or a height, I should always be referencing view width or view height. Well, view width and view height aren't always the correct ratio as far as width and height, right? If we look at our other devices here, we can click on maybe an iPad. Notice that an iPad is almost a square. So if you're designing something for an iPhone and you're trying to make a square and you're utilizing view width, well, it might look weird on an iPad. All right. Those dimensions may change. So let's go back to our iPhone SE. We've looked at view width. We've looked at view height. Now I want us to take a look at one of my personal favorites, which is the view minimum. So now this is going to essentially run a comparison between the height and width. And it's going to say, hey, which one of these is smaller? So in this case, the width is smaller. It cuts it in half because I'm only utilizing 50. And it sets that as the height. All right. So let's try the opposite end here. Let's try view max. Well, view max does exactly the same thing. It runs a comparison, says, all right, here is the height, here is the width. Which one of these is bigger? It notices that the height is bigger, cuts it in half, and sets that as the height of our division. All right. Those are different styles of measurement. Something really cool that comes with utilizing Vmin and Vmax is the consistency. Not only does Google give you, or the Google Inspector tools give you the ability to do this, you can also do something like responsive, where you can move the screen as you wish. And you'll notice that utilizing Vmax, well, if I go into opening up the browser very much, the more I open it up, the more it utilizes of the maximum capability, right? If I change it to something like Vmin, same thing, it changes. And as I open up the browser, it consistently utilizes the minimum. I typically like to utilize vmin, just because I like to account for the smaller unit of measurement the most, because I always imagine from a perspective of a person utilizing the application, I need to pay attention to what the smallest part of their viewport is. So I typically only use well, not only, but most of the time utilize vmin for my responsive web design styles. And I also would like to recommend to everybody that when you make an application, you make it for an iPhone first. The iPhone SE seems to be the smallest screen that they have available. I'm not sure about all these other ones. They probably do have one that's smaller. But start with a smaller screen, make your design, and then from there, start going outward. And we're going to go over media queries and how to handle these different sizes of screens here shortly. All right, let's hear from Tristan.
It's more like a confirmation, not really a question, but it seems like vmin kind of like caps it out of what object you're trying to create, so it doesn't keep like expanding. Does that make sense? Or
So you're saying,
because whenever you were using Vmax and you were making it wider, it just kept extending the size of it.
got it. Okay. Yes, and that's a very good observation. So if we go to Vmax, right, it's taking a look at the bottom and the right-hand side, right? And if I keep extending it, well, now the maximum is my width. So remember, I'm altering my height with my width now, right? So if I continue extending it, well, now I'm getting a scrollable division here, and that's because my width is way higher than my height. All right, so even though it cuts it by half and sets that as the height, it's still way taller than what I'm currently displaying. Whereas if I'm changing it to vmin, it's not necessarily capped, but it does give me a higher expectation that whatever it is that I'm trying to render on the screen will stay on the screen, right? Because no matter how much I manipulate it, it's only looking at the smallest portion of the viewport. So if I make it really small, well, it's only going to get smaller rather than getting bigger. Where Vmax, things could actually get bigger than what's on the viewport. Does that answer your question, Tristan?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. All right, I don't see any questions on the Yankee questions channel, so I'm gonna open it up here on Zoom. Does anyone else have any questions? And I think you had a question about this earlier, Gary. Did that answer your question?
It did. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Can you show how to open up Google's like different screen size?
Absolutely. Yeah, so first we go into our inspector tools. So we click on inspect, or you open it up through the tabs. From there, on the right, on the upper left-hand corner of the inspector tools, there is these screens. This one allows you to select an HTML element and get everything that you want back. The one on the right-hand side changes it to different screens. From there, you have a dimensions tab up above, which is a drop-down menu. You can choose responsive, where you move around the screen size that you're trying to work with, or you could even type it in right away. Or you could choose a device that they have here, like the iPhone SE or something like that. Now notice this is, I want everyone to understand this is how Google Chrome inside of inside of a phone would be rendering this application, right? Like if I go on Google Chrome on my iPhone and I have this exact iPhone and I go to this application, this is what I would see. But this doesn't necessarily apply to like downloaded apps. If you were trying to do something like a downloaded app, you would actually need an emulator, and that goes into a whole nother black hole of development. Does that answer your question, Owen?
Yeah, thank you.
What about Safari? Would it look like that on Safari?
So Safari and Chrome are pretty similar. I believe Safari leverages on Chrome a lot. But there are different browsers that will render information in a different format than Chrome. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I know Safari and Chrome are very similar.
Chrome, Safari, and whatever replacing Internet Explorer, I can't think of the name right now. Bing all use V8 under the hood nowadays. They all use Chromium or a version of Chrome. They really do, yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. I think Firefox is like one of those that if you're making an application that you want to ensure renders properly in Firefox, you have to develop it inside of Firefox. But don't take my word for it. All right. Awesome. So now the next portion that we're going to go into is going to be some text sizes. Let's go ahead and take a look at what text looks like. Let me actually exit this format here. And inside of this division layout, I'm actually going to take off my height. And here I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of classes here. So I'm going to have a div that will have a p tag. This div will have a class name of rem size. And I'm just going to multiply this times 3. I think it will populate correct. Oh, no, it didn't populate correctly. All right, let's do this. So we're just going to do the whole wow example here. And then we're going to start nesting. All right, so now these wows, they may look like they're right next to each other linearly, but notice that they're all nested inside of another. So our first child wow is a child of the wow above. All right, they're not both children of this entire parent division. The only children of this entire parent division is our first wow, which is a parent of this wow and the division right on top. And then we have another division down below that just holds one wow. All right. Now let's start applying what rem sizes would do to this wow information. Let me actually, let's see if I can do something here. All right, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit so we can all see it. And now let's apply some rem sizes here. I'm gonna come over to index.css and make my rem size class. In this rem size class, all I simply want to do is apply the different types of fonts. So let's say that I want to make this, we have one EM or we have rem, right? So we have EM and rem. Let's say I want to do 2 EM. All right, well, we can see that if I utilize 2 EM, it kind of works as a multiplication factor, right? The first one shows up at actually 2 EM. This one shows up at 4 EM, and the last one shows up at 8 EM. And the reason why that multiplication is happening is because it's being nested inside of one another. Now, the opposite side of that is rem. Rem does not have that multiplication. It just simply emphasizes these words, but they are all at 2 EM. It's just being regulated, meaning that there is no amplification of it. EM has the amplification where it multiplies. Rem is regulated, no multiplication. All right, does anyone have any questions over rem and EM? All right, great. Doesn't seem like there are any questions. So now let's dive into Flexbox. This is another one of my personal favorites. I love utilizing Flex, and we're about to see why. All right, let's create a bunch of boxes here. Let me grab that. bring it out here so that it's not in our way. And let me comment that out. All right. Sure, let's keep it as measurements. And let's go ahead and bring in our boxes. So let's just have division of class box. And let's multiply that times, yeah, let's do 10. All right, let's just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and finally 10. All right, so there's all 10 of our boxes. They are of class box. And you can see all of this styling being applied because in app CSS, it didn't get commented out. So let me go ahead and comment that out. Now recreate our boxes here. Okay, so now it's commented out. Now it won't get in the way. Let's go into index CSS and create our boxes. So now my box is going to have a border. This border will be red, it will be solid, and it will be 1 pixel. It will have a height of 98. Or actually, let's just use 10 vmin. And let's use a width of 10 vmin. All right, so there's all of our boxes. And you can see how it's stretching out measurements all the way across, right? Well, before, when we did inline block, we just simply added it to the box class, right? And I can change that again. We can see display, inline, that's gonna squeeze it. We could do inline block, and that's gonna open it up to where it all falls inside of one individual class. And I can make this smaller, or I can make this bigger. We can see how it's all being reactive and responding appropriately. All right, great. Well, now we're gonna go into something called display flex. So here is our measurements. I can do something which is the parent division. I'm no longer affecting the box itself. I am affecting the container that is holding that box. I'm gonna add display here. And instead of display inline, I'm gonna say, hey, I want you to display flex. Notice how as soon as I ran display flex, it shows all of my content from left to right. All right, so here it is from left to right, 1 through 10. I can squeeze it, and because of that vmin, it's making my boxes smaller. All right, and we can still see the numbers of 1 through 10. So display flex did that pretty easy for me. Now, let's say that I wanted this to be 15 vmin. Well, notice that I'm doing 15 vmin. My height is 15 vmin, but my width isn't. All right, if I look at my width starts squeezing it. Well, that's not necessarily something that I want. So maybe there's gotta be a way for me to fix that from happening so that things aren't being squeezed anymore. Well, I can give this a width, and let's say that my width is going to be 100 VW in this case. Well, notice that if I use 100 V width, it kind of gives me a scroll bar. So this isn't working the way that I wanted to. It's going way too far on my width. So let's run with 100%. Well, 100% still gives me a bit of a scroll bar problem. That's happening because of my pixels here. So one final attempt, let's go into 98%. And now at 98%, we still have a scroll bar. Wow, okay, let's go 6. Is that better? There you go. So 6 squeezes it. All right, so 96%, it's utilizing 96% of my browser. If I squeeze it, it still utilizes 96%. It's not completely touching it, but we do have our browser. And notice how my boxes, they're being squeezed to stay inside, but they're not following the width parameter that I passed. I'm telling them that the width should be the same as the height. So I should see boxes instead of rectangles as I squeeze them. Huh. Well, what else can we do to fix this? Well, there's a couple of things. We could do something like justify content, and we could do space around. And if we do space around and we open this up, maybe instead of 10 boxes, we do something like 5 boxes so we can see this portion. All right, so when I utilize space around, you can see that my display flex is now automatically doing a pretty nice gap there in between all of my boxes. I could do something like space between. And with space between, the outer boxes get pinned to the outsides, but we still have a pretty nice automatic spacing in between all of my boxes. I never added a margin or anything. It's just simply spreading them, right? Or I could even do something like, hey, I want you to justify content center. And then it will center all of them in the division. All right. So with that said, let's go ahead and add a height. And for my height, let's just do 50 view height for that. Well, just like we can justify content to alter the left and right, we can align items to alter the up or down. So I can say, hey, I want to align items top. That will put them all to the top. I can say I want to align items bottom. Or excuse me, maybe it's end. Yeah, there you go. End. And that will throw them all the way to the end. So start puts them at the very top. End puts them at the bottom. And center will center everything in the division. All right, so I have my justify content center. I have my align item center. And maybe once it's centered, I still want there to be a gap. Well, I can add a gap and say, hey, I want there to be a gap of 5 vmin. And now in between each one of these items, we have a gap of 5 vmin. All right, so Flexbox is really, really powerful. We can also go back into the problem that we had earlier. So let me remove some of the CSS that we have here. All right, so let's remove that and let's bring back our other boxes that we commented out. So here's my 10 boxes and I'm running into that problem where everything is being squeezed, right? Well, that's because I haven't given it an overflow attribute. Well, what I want you to do is I want you to say overflow scroll, and now it's able to account for overflow. It's still squeezing my boxes though. So let's see, we had display flex with 90% overflow scroll. Oh, we can add in here, we want this to have a minimum width because as of now, it has none. But if I put 15 vmin, now it enforces my minimum width. All right, so there's my minimum width. We have my scroll bars again. In this case, we want overflow X instead of overflow Y. And then we want to add a gap as well. Let's say we want a gap of 10 vmin. And now we have that Netflix effect, right? Where we have our films, and then we could scroll left or right between the films. As far as how we create those buttons that you can click and then it jumps from one side to another, all it is a JavaScript function. When you click on that button, JavaScript grabs this scroll bar and then it scrolls it by a certain number of pixels or a certain number of positions to the right-hand side or the left-hand side. And I think that was a question from earlier by James. Did that answer your question, James? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Fantastic. All right, and that is display flex. Something else that you can do is you can tell it how to handle overflow instead. So we could say, hey, I want you to have something like, hey, I want flex wrap to be a thing. And in this case, I just want you to wrap my content. So now instead of allowing things to overflow out of the division, I can wrap it. So when it runs out of space, it starts on the next line, just like inline block this. And look at this gap of 10 vmin. That gap is no longer just applying between one box to another from left and right. It is also applying from one box to another from top to bottom. And Juan, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about I think it was Sean made a video game and they were talking about deleting items that went off of the screen. So whenever we're doing kind of like this Netflix effect, we want to do the same thing, limit the amount of items that we have that are going off of the screen, or not so much because of memory and stuff.
I think what you would like to do at that point is have some sort of timer function on each one of these divisions and how long they exist. And then as soon as they essentially exit the border, that event would trigger the timer. And then for maybe a certain amount of time that if that division lives outside while being hidden, and then it gets erased, and then another division falls. Does that answer your question there?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. All right. So there's our display here. We could even turn it into, oh, there's a couple of other things that we can do with display flex actually. So here's display flex. We can also tell it which way we want to have our direction here. So we can say flex direction column. And if we turn it into a column, it just simply drops from top to bottom. We could have something like column reverse, and column reverse will just flip it upside down. Let's say 10 to 1. And same thing for flex, right? We could also still continue with flex, but just turn it into flex. Oh, excuse me. It's row reverse. There you go. Turn it into row reverse, and now we have 10 down to 8, and then 7 down to 1. All right, so there's a couple of other things that you can use there. Now, the main reason why I very much like utilizing Flexbox is because of how easy it is to just center information. Right, so now that I have my flex, I can just say, hey, I want to justify content center, and I want to align items center. And I can just bring back my height here of 50 VH. Oh, let's just do it. And then we'll show everything centered. There you go. Right, so now I can scroll from left to right to grab independent elements. But it seems like because it's centered, it's not showing me items 1 and 2. So I can just take this off. There you go. Now it shows me all my items. All right, so that's a really good benefit. I strongly recommend that you get accustomed to Flexbox. I see Gary just shared on the Yankee questions the Flexbox Froggy. That is a fantastic game to play if if you're trying to learn a new concept. Usually somebody made a game about this concept and how to learn it. Gamifying is one way of efficient learning. All right, so that is it for Flexbox. Does anyone else have any questions regarding Flexbox? All right, no questions regarding Flexbox. In that case, let's move on into media queries. Let me go ahead and comment all of this out because we are no longer going to need it. All right, so there's index CSS. What is killing you? Is this what's killing you? There you go. All right, so here's index CSS, has all of our CSS elements. We have app.js. I'm gonna actually comment all of this out as well. And I'm just gonna bring in an image for Ditto here. Oh. All right, and this image is going to have a class name of my image. All right, so now we go to index CSS, we have ditto. Let's go ahead and start manipulating this image. And say my image and say, all right, well, I want this to have a height of 30 v min. I want it to have a width of 30 v min. And I also want it to have a background color that is brown. And I want there to be a border radius of 5 v min. There you go. So there's our good old image there. Let me just quickly add a parent division here so we can center it. Right, and let's give it the ID of parent. And for this ID, we're just going to simply go with display flex. Give it a width of 100%. Let's give it a height of 100 VH. And then let's do justify content center, align items center. All right, so there's my ditto in the center of my screen, working pretty well, and I have my image. Fantastic. Well, now, if I'm working within a website and I want to make this a little bit more responsive, maybe there's a couple of things that I want to consider at different screens. For example, if we go into our inspector tools and click on a mobile device. Oh, let me go back into that. There we go. We have our mobile device. Well, now you can see that ditto becomes a little bit harder to see at this height and width, right? Maybe at this height and width, I don't want there to be this specific media queries, or I don't want this CSS to be the end all be all. Maybe now I actually don't want to pin it to the bottom. I just want to pin it to the upper left-hand corner and have some text wrapping around it, right? Well, in that case, I would add something like at media. And the media query that I'm working with is the screen. So what I want to analyze in the screen size is I want to say, hey, at max width, notice that this is 375. So in this case, the max width that I want to work with is 376 pixels. Then I want my parent to no longer have justify content center. So instead I want to have justify content start or justify content start. And then I no longer wanted to have a line item center. Instead, I want a line items start as well. And that pins it over to the left-hand corner. Well, let's see what happens when we change the dimensions here. I'm going to turn it into responsive. Here I'm at 351. Let's go to 375 now. Okay, so here's the width of 375, right? When I go over to 376, okay, that's still triggering it. Now let's go to 377. Well, at 377, this media query, this if statement, right, is no longer being triggered. So it's saying if the screen is less than 376 pixels, then trigger this CSS inside of my media query body. So the media query is an if statement saying if these conditions are met for my screen size, then apply this CSS. All right, the moment I turn this back to 376, we're going to see that it pins it to the upper left-hand corner. All right, now what happens if we change this to min? All right, so we're saying, hey, at minimum 376, okay, 376 is the number. Let's go to 375. Well, now at 375, it has me centered. But anything above 376 will trigger this information. right? So like I mentioned earlier, it's always better to go from smaller to bigger. So as you continue working through this, you might be working with a lot of min width media queries as you continue to extend your project, right? And that's just a simple rule for responsive web design. Start small, and then iterate through the bigger screens as you continue on. There's definitely, you shouldn't have to add a ton of media queries, especially if you're using design libraries, but they are very useful and there are definitely times where they are required in order to make a dynamic design. And that is it for media queries. Does anyone have any questions about media queries?
Just real quick, that's a decorator specifically, right? Or it just looks like one.
Yeah, this would be a CSS decorator, essentially. That's correct. But this is just shooting an if statement,
Gotcha. Thank you.
of course. Kristen?
So this decorator is more so for those rare instances of, let's say a device has a specific size to it, you don't want it to be, you want it to be different on that one specifically, but nothing else.
Not necessarily. I think the way that I like to think about this is you got to go through these screens when you're making your application. So for example, if we take a look at the Poke API, right? And I continue to scroll down. Notice how my menu just disappeared, right? And if I think I click on this, I can still see the menu. Okay, good. But if I continue to scroll all the way to the right-hand side, oh, they removed it. So before they had this to where it turned into a hamburger menu, but now they have it to where it turns into a scroll bar. Let me check Amazon. Amazon will do it. Okay, so Amazon, we squeeze it. Wow, they don't do it either. Okay, cool.
Okay, so it's more so like whenever you reach a certain size, then like you just put in new parameters of like, hey, this is how this is gonna look once it reaches this parameter, essentially.
Yes, I think that second scenario would be good. And nav bars are something that I always like to reference to. So this nav bar, for example, right now it's showing me all my layouts, right? But you see how once it meets this specific screen size here, turns into a hamburger. And then I have this side menu that opens up if I click on it. Whereas before, that didn't exist. That's a media query being activated there. James?
When you're doing this, do you recommend starting default with a like big, like normal, I guess, like laptop computer screen and then shrinking down, and the media inquiries tend to have like a max width descriptor, or would you actually sometimes do it the opposite where you start small and then you scale it up for bigger screens?
I would do it the opposite way. Start small and then scale it up. I know it sounds weird, but you're gonna find it that it's way easier to make things more adaptive for bigger screens than it is to start big and then trying to make it adaptive for smaller screens. Just as a rule of thumb, always start small and then go big, of
Cool, thank you.
course. All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions, so let me go ahead and stop our recording here.